Hello and welcome to episode 204 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, welcome back. We're nearly there. The big man's nearly arrived.
It has. Father Christmas, I'm presuming you're talking about, but it's... Well, we might as well do the admin bit now you've mentioned Christmas, just so the listeners know. We're going to have a show this week and we'll have another one next week, and then we'll have a mini break, so over Christmas for a couple of weeks. So, yeah, you've still got Andy and I for the next couple of weeks. How you been, Andy? I haven't seen you for a while.
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, just preparing for Christmas. It's so busy this time of year. I'm loving it, though. We've got the elf on the shelf.
Oh, don't hit the elf on the shelf, Andy.
Oh, it's a nightmare. I don't know why we ever agreed to do this kind of thing. But actually, we've been a bit cheeky this year. We've got one of those elf cameras that we've put up, and the elf arrived on the first. Actually, if there's any children in the room listening, we don't want to break the magic. So parents, if you've got any children, close their ears now or fast forward a bit. But we put the camera up in the room, the elf camera, and we left a little note to say, unfortunately, as you're getting a little bit older this year and we're very busy with the younger children, the elf won't be able to come every single day, so they'll be keeping an eye on you with the camera. And it's basically like a pretend camera, and it just blinks in the corner, and so the children still feel like they're being sort of watched by the elves.
So it's like 1984. Yeah. You've just replaced the elf with Big Brother.
Yeah, exactly right. But I tell you what, they've been so good this month. It's brilliant.
So would I if I was under 24-hour surveillance, Andy.
Yeah, it is quite scary, I'll be honest. But so that's what I've been busy doing, pretending that the children are being watched.
Well, we've done it for the first time this year, and I was always averse to doing it, because once you start something, and it makes me sound like the Grinch, but once you start, you're not going to be able to stop. So we've done it this year, and I've kind of got into it, actually, to be honest with you. Every night what tends to happen is we get to, like, we're going to go to bed, and then go, oh no, the elf. Or, like we had the other day, where we'd gone out for a Christmas dinner and with some friends, and we came back, and obviously we woke up in the morning, and you're slightly less, we weren't quite bouncing out of bed like we would normally do, and we woke up slightly hungover as my daughter came in as usual, 6:45. Dad, can I go downstairs? And I suddenly, both of us looked at each other, thought, oh my God, where's the elf, for starters? What are we going to do with the elf? But all of this just passed between us in
just one look.
No, stay there, stay there. Dad's going to go and make a cup of tea first. Well, can't I come? All that. So everybody who's listening to this podcast who has children will probably be either smiling to themselves because they've done a similar thing.
Yeah.
And so the elf on the shelf, it's now, I think we're cursed with the thing for the next few years. Because obviously my youngest is a fair age difference between my eldest, but the good news is I think this will be the last year that she'll believe in all the magic of Christmas, and so she'll take on the role of the elf on the shelf, I'd like to think, next year. But anyway, less of the elf. Should we talk about the podcast? What's on it?
Yeah, let's talk about what we're here for. What have we got coming up on this week's pod?
Right, there are 3 pieces this week. I'm going to give us a bit of a break from investing. We've done a lot of investing. I know people like that. So rather than the investment markets, we're going to talk about crowdfunding, a very topical subject at the moment. So I'm going to go through the sort of what, whys, how, for of crowdfunding. I'm also going to talk about energy switching, a service we looked at, which you could probably pipe in and chip in on, Andy. I know you've used a service we've talked about previously, but this is something very new. And consumer rights. Now, a topic that is very relevant this time of year. If you're going to buy things, what are your rights for taking them back? It's something that's always worth reminding people, especially when they're buying gifts, etc. So, which do you want to do first, Andy?
Let's go for the crowdfunding thing. What have we got?
Right, crowdfunding. I don't know if you know what crowdfunding is, or anybody listening to the podcast. Now, crowdfunding is a means for a company to raise money to be able to carry out a project or grow.
Am I right in saying that it doesn't have to be a company? It can be an individual? Or is it a specific company?
You can have individuals. It tends to be a company or someone trying to do a project. There are different types, and that will actually influence whether it's a company or a person. So the 4 types of crowdfunding that I'll explain is a case where you can have let's say somebody was trying to launch a project. They're trying to do something interesting. Let's imagine they're trying to record a record that they want to release. Now, a crowdfunding exercise would be whereby they would use one of the well-known crowdfunding sites out there. There are sites like Kickstarter you may have heard of. There's others that are like Crowdcube. There's a whole list of them. And what they do is they go on there and they will put a video saying about their project, why they want to do it, how much money they want to raise, what they're going to do with the money, and try and get the project off the ground because they haven't got the funds. It's a modern way of trying to raise funds for a project or business or something that people are trying to do without going to mainstream banks and requesting loans. So there are 4 types of crowdfunding that you'll normally see. There are equity-based ones. So an example of that would be they'd be a company who wants to, say, raise a certain amount of money because they want to grow the business in a certain way. And what will happen is they will invite members of the public to pay money to get a stake in the business. So they'll put up a small stake of their firm, maybe 5%, and you can pay money to buy shares in that company. And they're unlisted shares, so they're not tradable. You basically get a portion of the company with your money, and it enables that company to go on and do whatever it is they promise they're going to do. It's members of the public, so it's like peer-to-peer. There's loan-based crowdfunding. This is really peer-to-peer lending in a roundabout way. What that will be is you're asking people to borrow money from them, and then you'll pay that back, so it enables you to do whatever you want to do. Again, it can be individuals and it can be companies. So that's really a peer-to-peer basis, but it's crowdfunding. The word crowd, obviously, lots of people, members of the public, the crowd will give you money. Donation-based is more whereby you will donate money, but with no reward from it. So we had the equity one where you got a stake in a company. You may decide to crowd fund a project that you want to do, and people will just donate out of the goodness of their heart because they love the idea of the project. They want to see it succeed. You might want to be changing the world in some way, and they go, yeah, do you know what? I love what you're doing. Here's £50. Off you go. And they get nothing back. The 4th type is a reward-based crowdfunding exercise. And what happens there is rather than necessarily getting an equity stake, you may get a reward of some kind. So going back to the original example I said, is if somebody was trying to crowdfund their first CD or album so they could produce it, you may get a signed copy. If you put in a certain level of donation, you may get your name in the inside cover of the album sleeve if you put in a certain amount. You may get a ticket to a concert if you put in even more. And so it's a reward-based system to try and encourage people to put more and more money into the crowdfunding. So crowdfunding is a new phenomena that's obviously occurred in this modern world of interconnectivity, and it's very popular for people who are trying to find a way of getting involved in exciting projects, but also people looking at it as a way to make money. Now, the reason it was relevant is if you ever heard of Monzo. Now, Monzo are an app-based bank, and there is an argument that they've only just got their banking license in the last year. There is a debate that you could describe them more as a price comparison site, because what they're really trying to do, a bank will take people's deposits, they will loan them out to other people, and so they operate more like a traditional bank. But where Monzo is going to try and make more of its money from is by creating a marketplace of services that they would recommend and get a commission from. So that's what they've stated in the past that they're looking to do. So it could be, just speculating, what they will do is that they would offer their customers means to be able to choose cheaper mortgages from a third party, or switch their energy bills or something like that, and they'll get a kickback. But it's by having such scale, because they're an enormous entity. So Monzo had an equity crowdfunding exercise about a few weeks ago, and it made the press. So before I go on to that, because this is why it's relevant, because I said something on Twitter that caused a bit of a stir.
Unlike you.
It is unlike me, Andy. But there'll be many people, there'll be lots of listeners who listen to this podcast who would have been involved in that crowdfunding. So just give people who aren't into crowdfunding just a quick overview of how it really works. So you would go onto one of these crowdfunding sites. If you were looking for a project to invest in, you'd find a project. That project will tell you how much they're trying to raise. They would say how much they've raised so far. They would tell you whether it's going to be for a stake of equity, whether it's just a donation, a reward. Then they will tell you what the money's going to be used for. So if it's to do an album, to grow the business, they will tell you how long the pitch is open for, and they'll tell you the number of people who have invested. Now, there are more and more companies out there, particularly fintechs, who are starting to use crowdfunding as a way to, I suppose the word is, utilise the goodwill from customers to try and grow their business. And Monzo is, like I said, an app-only bank, and they had a crowdfunding exercise about 2 weeks ago that they looked to raise £20 million of funding from the customers that they have. And they are the general public, ultimately, they're customers, but Monzo is well liked by its customers. If you imagine the banks out there, First Direct often tops the customer service happiness charts, so they're often at the top. But Monzo knocked them off this year for the first time. They became kings of the pile in terms of customer satisfaction, which is quite an incredible achievement from an entity that's only a few years old. And I mean, they're a big outfit, Monzo, now, the amount of customers that they have. And they raised this money that they wanted. It was for an equity stake in the company, so you could buy shares. There was a limit. You could only invest up to £2,000. But they raised it in 2 hours and 42 minutes. That's £20 million in 2 hours and 42 minutes from their customers who just said, I want a piece of Monzo. I think it's so great. Monzo had done a whole round of funding going out to institutional investors to raise money. So this was only a portion of the overall money that they raised, but they allowed their customers to input that money. Now, I put out there on Twitter and said, well, hold on just 1 second. Before we all get carried away in the media going, this is amazing, Monzo have just raised all this money in just 2 hours. They're going to take over the world. They're enormous. They've now been valued at £1 billion. I just made the statement and the observation. What we've got is a loss-making entity. And to be clear, Monzo lost £33 million in the previous year, who have convinced the general public to invest their own money in untradeable, unlisted shares. And that, to me, was a bit of a, like, is that such a fantastic thing? It wasn't a statement about Monzo. And of course, what was interesting, it caused a real polarised view. It was quite amusing. When you went on to Twitter and just typed the word Monzo, what I'd written and the responses actually was the top thing about Monzo on the day that they'd raised all this money. And my point was convincing members of the public to put money in shares that they can't actually sell. Now, what happens if you have unlisted shares? To sell them to somebody else is incredibly difficult. And the way you're going to actually extract the value typically is if is an IPO, so they list on the stock market, or somebody buys them. Well, Monzo had already stated that they're not looking to do an IPO, so they're not going to list on the stock market anytime soon. So you're already saying then, well, you're hoping someone's going to buy them, but their plans are to keep growing. So this company is now valued at £1 billion. That is going to be a pretty big company that's going to buy them. Let's be honest. If you're thinking that you put in money into a company and you're going to get rich from it, if you put in £500, because when they actually announced how many investors went into the Monzo crowdfunding, there was just over 36,000, I think it was. Divide that money down, that number, 20 million, it works out about £555 was the average person. It's quite a lot put into it. All the customers were buzzing. They were all happy. And I'm not knocking anybody who did it. I think what people misinterpreted, mine was not a slight on Monzo. People love what they do. It was just the observation that a company had managed to get people to put that amount of money in to shares that weren't listed. And in a world where anybody could do that, the risks are quite high for the individual investors. There was this assumption that they're going to get rich. And as I was going to say, if a company is worth $1 billion, to get to, let's say they're going to get to $1 trillion, even if you put in £500, to get sort of valuations to go tenfold, 1,000-fold, you're not going to get mega rich out of it. Some people will only put £10, £20 or whatever into that Monzo buying shares, and it was obviously oversubscribed. But you've got to think that we've only just had our first $1 trillion company in the world. $1 trillion, obviously, when you work it back down, is way less in pounds. You're talking probably about sort of 600 billion or something like that. I say only, it's big. But you realise that this thing's got to really go some if you're going to make a lot of money out of it. So my observation caused a bit of a stir. I had a lot of people have a pop at me. I didn't understand how tech companies work. It's perfectly acceptable for companies to be loss-making at this stage of their development. And then cite Amazon. Have you never heard of Amazon? I mean, to pick the biggest company in the world and then cite that as an example of why crowdfunding is an absolute must and assuring, and I'm an absolute idiot, was I think was almost ironic, because there've been plenty of companies that did go bust. And as if by magic, the risk I wanted to point out, for example, before we go into this, the risks obviously are that the rewards can be good, you can make lots of money, but you're not going to probably make lots of money. You've got to bank on somebody else coming and buying the company or their listing. The risks obviously are that the company could go bust. So we're not talking about just Monzo, but any crowdfunding thing you do. That company could go bust if you're going to get an equity stake in it and you don't get anything in return. The returns you get aren't guaranteed on the shares anyway, and the shares will probably be hard to sell, like I mentioned. But the other thing is that the crowdfunding site itself could go bust in amongst all the whole crowdfunding. So the site that was actually orchestrating and facilitating the crowdfunding may go bust as your money's being gathered. But just hours prior to it was almost at the same time, a company called eMove, which many of you may have heard of. eMove they're an online estate agent, one of the bigger ones. They actually bought out Topilo, who is Sarah Beanie's company, and they have done a number of rounds of crowdfunding, and they just done a 1.8 million crowdfunding round in July this year that was successful. But it's just been announced about the same time as the Monzo thing occurred, and I was getting a lot of stick on Twitter. But I mean, there's lots of people who absolutely highlighted the fact that, yeah, I was right in what I was saying. It was just a statement of fact. But for all the people including people who work in the tech industry, including people with one or two that run robo-advisors, which was even more worrying, were saying that, yeah, this is about wanting to be part of something great. But I don't think people understand the risks. They just look at the reward. eMove has gone into administration. It's basically gone bust. And now the investors who were part of the previous crowdfunding rounds, and some of those had equity, are now complaining about the fact that they were misled. And what happened, just like any company that runs at huge losses, they actually ran out of money. And the guy who's in charge of it, their CEO, basically came out and said that when they were part of the mergers and with things with Topilo and everything, as part of all those deals that went on at that time, when they were looking, at one point they would try to buy Purple Bricks earlier this year. That shows you the scale. It would have, as they were getting bigger and more adventurous, they were moving into the second place in the market behind Purple Bricks in that online estate agency world. The funding that they'd been promised by other sources that would be brought on board didn't materialise, so they ran out of money. That was it. They ran out of money. A loss-making company ran out of cash. That is obviously a true risk, and this is what happened. So those people now are left with nothing. The customers of eMove are obviously disappointed. So that just shows you the risks of this. Everyone looks at the rewards, and this company were looking to blow the doors off just 6 months ago, and now they're at the point where people are going to be picking over the bones of a company that had so much promise. I'm not saying Monzo is going to do that, but the reality is, if you're going to get involved in crowdfunding, you have to realise that you're doing it, you're speculating. You're not investing, you are speculating. You're punting some money on the hope that you're going to get an outsized return. Now, if you look at some of the stuff the FCA put out there and on the Money Advice Service, they say you should never invest more than 10% of your money that you have to invest, not your money, the money you've got to invest, into crowdfunding, because you've got to be prepared for the fact that you might lose it all. So crowdfunding is an interesting concept. I'm not knocking it, but I just think that what was happening is you were getting to the stage where people don't understand the risks. Very much the focus is on the rewards, but not on the risks. Monzo, for example, there was a lot of bad press about, well, not a lot, but there was a bit of bad press because they were allowing customers to use their overdrafts to buy shares in their own company, which is very strange if you ask me. I'm not sure that should be possible. It's not illegal, but I don't think it should be possible. You can't, as a bank, give people loans to buy shares in your company, but overdraft, there's no rules to stop people doing what they want with that. So crowdfunding, not a terrible idea. There's a lot of risks. I personally wouldn't do it unless it was something I just loved the idea of. But people out there who champion it and start becoming uncomfortable when somebody makes a statement highlighting the risks, and actually some of them started becoming abusive. One guy called me stupid, which I don't mind being called stupid online, Andy. It won't be the first time. But you've just got to be realistic. If you're invested in Monzo, fantastic. I'm not knocking it. As long as you're happy that your money is in there and it's locked in there and you're locked into the fortunes of a company that is growing, then that's more than happy and good luck to you. Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 Investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insight, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers and the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service. Let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show.
Okay, so Damien, we're going to look at energy switching. We've mentioned energy switching before, a company called Flipper, who I went on to use and still use now. But you're going to tell me about someone new's coming to this market.
Yeah, so there's a nice link between what we were talking about before as an alternative way of raising funds. So people wanting to raise money don't have to go to mainstream banks. They can use things like crowdfunding, or if you're growing a company, a tech startup, you can go on Dragon's Den, which is probably a bit more public, and they're probably fraught with dangers and possible embarrassments. Yeah. I actually knew somebody who did it successfully, which I will probably interview when we eventually get one day to do the next podcast series of One Giant Leap. But this company called Look After My Bills was on Dragon's Den, I think it was in January 2018, so earlier this year, and they secured the best ever deal on Dragon's Den. Really? They got £120,000 for 3% of their company, so it shows you the size of what they were valuing their company at. It was about, broadly speaking, without me doing it in my head, about 3 million or so, and that was incredibly exciting for them. The guys behind it were previously, they seem to be into energy anyway, and if you ever heard of these concepts of the big deal, was one of them. You know, when you get lots and lots of people together collectively, again, another crowd element, that you use the scales of that crowd to be able to go and negotiate a better deal with an energy company for everybody. The guys behind that created Look After My Bills, and that's the name of the firm. You can go Google them, and what it is an automated way to always be on the best energy deal. That's the way they pitch it. So like everybody else, you sit there, topical this time of the year, you sit there, am I on a good energy deal? You may fix 1 year, but then you come off that deal and end up on their expensive tariffs, their standard tariffs. You never get round to doing it. What this service does is it automatically signs you up to the best deal. So once you're in their service, you give them authority to keep switching for you. So when there's a deal that will be better, that will save you at least £50, they'll flip you or switch you over to it. And we looked at it this week and we reviewed it on the website. So if you want to know a full review, I'm going to go through quickly the highlights of that review. But if you want to see the full review, go onto the Money to the Masses website. But they have 80,000 customers already, and they claim to be able to save people £253 on their energy bills. And the service is free to use, which is one of the key points, because some of the alternatives aren't free.
Yeah, like Flipper charge £25 per year. So straight away, that's £25 you're saving by looking at this alternative company, Look After My Bills. Good.
But there is a catch. So, like all these things, there's the good and the bad, pros and the cons. And I always like to have a balance. So you look at the people always focus on the pros, not always on the cons. Now, the process, you go onto their site. It takes about 2 minutes to sign up. You put in your email, you select your energy provider that you're with and the tariff. And you can even choose to have renewable energy if you want to. That's available. Now, what happens in the background, they have an algorithm that looks at all the different tariffs out there. It takes into other factors, not just cost. So it looks into customer service and happiness. And if there is a tariff that can save you £50, what will happen is it will present that to you. But it doesn't give you lots of options. It gives you one option. So it ends up eliminating the idea, you know, with what's the phrase? Is it not the paradox of choice, you know, the equivalent thing, I've forgotten the phrase, whereby if you present people with multiple options, they will actually choose none. Yeah. And they will just do nothing. So it only gives you one of them. And assuming you accept that and you give them the authority, therefore, from that day on to keep flipping you onto new energy tariffs, off you go. You give them meter readings to your old and new company. Now, the pros of it is it saves you time and effort. It's automatic. And they factor in customer service. Now, There have been people who, if you look online, have said slightly negative things like about any company, said the switching took a little bit longer than they thought. The biggest con with the service is that the reason it is free is because they take commissions from the companies that they switch to. Martin Lewis does this. You get paid by the company the energy provider who you recommend. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just the way the system works. The negative is that they only suggest companies that will pay them. So if there is a cheaper deal out there that exists for you, potentially in your circumstances, but they don't pay referral fees, then they won't be within their system, and their algorithm won't pick them up, and they won't be suggested. So the fact that most companies do pay referral fees and commissions obviously negates the impact of that to somewhat, but it won't necessarily mean you will always be on the cheapest. You'll be on a cheap tariff. Now, they only do domestic energy. They don't do business energy. So if your company's got energy bills, they won't do that. It's only for dual fuel. So if you have your gas and electricity with the same provider, sometimes you can get cheaper deals if you have your energy with different people. Lots of people don't. I don't, for example. It's just easier to have it with one person. And you have to pay by direct debit as well. I think that's a fairly standard thing these days that most people would. But it's all to ensure that you're going to get the cheapest deal. You still need to do meter readings. That's part of it. To make the service work best, you're going to have to keep putting meter readings into it so they can actually look at what your energy you're using. So it's a growing popularity service. I like the look of it. I like what it does. Of course, like I said, there is the downside to it, that it only recommends people that have commissions, but that is pretty standard within the industry itself. Now, there are alternatives to this. So this whole piece is for people who are looking at, they want to reduce their energy bill. The lazy way is this. But there are alternatives. There's Flipper, which is the one that you've used, haven't you, Andy? Now they will do they have a wider selection, so they will include those that don't pay referral fees. Like I say, the bigger companies tend to pay referral fees anyway, but they include those that don't. And the reason they can do that is because they charge you a £25 annual fee regardless. So they'll just keep moving you around, but you're paying for that service. So that's the alternative if you want a wider market. And you seem to be fairly happy with it, don't you, Andy, when you've used it?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what you do to start off with, exactly the same, 2 minutes to fill in the forms, fill in your current provider. You actually give them access to log in if you're happy to, so they can see your history, so they get an idea of how much usage you use, and then they can take that information and go off and do it. And actually, in the 2.5, 3 years that I've been using them, I've only been flipped once or twice, I think. And yeah, I'll be honest, I've saved a good few £100 every year that I've used them, compared to when I look at 3 or 4 years ago when I kept with the same provider. So it does work, for sure.
And so, I mean, that's fantastic. I call these things in life, even with Look After My Bills, it's a case of, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's not about perfection. It's about doing something. It's an 80-20 principle. Something like this will save you a lot of money. If you really want to go to the absolute nuances and get on the cheapest deal, then you always can generally find cheaper. There are other services. WeFlip is more equivalent to Look After My Bills. They will flip you when you can save £50, and they do it on a commission basis as well, so that makes the service free. There's another one called Labrador that I'd never heard of, and they flip you when there's a minimum of an £80 saving, but they can do automatic, or you can do it where you have to approve the switch, so it's a kind of a middle ground. So that's Labrador if you don't want to give people complete autonomy. And of course there's Martin Lewis's Money Saving Expert Energy Club, which works by sending you email notifications where you set the limit of what you want to save, so the amount, so when it hits a certain level they will email you and say, here's a deal, go for it, and you can switch. So they have a much wider market. They don't just focus on those that will pay a commission, but obviously, like I say, most of them will pay Mr. Lewis a commission anyway. So use one of those services if you can't be bothered to shop around, and actually you cannot have to do it ever again.
Good stuff. And to finish on the last bit, consumer rights, wasn't it?
Yeah, consumer rights. I mean, it's one of these things, I laugh about it. I'm terrible about consumer rights in terms of my own. I always feel bad taking things back to a shop.
Yeah.
And it is partly because you never fully understand what your rights are.
I think it's a very British thing as well, isn't it? I know I don't like to sort of pigeonhole specific nations or groups of people, but it does seem to be a very British thing. Although I think the youth of today are actually growing up and appreciating the recycling, the use and reuse, and actually if something's not right, then take it back. I think we are getting better at doing these things.
Yeah, my wife's a bit of a legend at it. She'd take anything back, and obviously within reason. And after going through with a fine tooth comb of the rules, this will make anybody feel better and feel more empowered to take things back. So I'm going to quickly rattle through it. The rules are quite straightforward, and I was surprised at one or two nuances. Now, the Sales of Goods Act is what actually is the act that your rights are based upon, especially when it comes to refunds. Now, there were different sets of rules. It changed back in September 2015, so I'm only assuming you're buying things since then. Now, any product you buy has to meet 3 standards, which you need to remember: satisfactory quality, fit for purpose, and they were as described. If they don't meet those criteria, for whatever reason, after you've bought it, you have a right to some form of refund, and actually your consumer rights are triggered. But what you can have and what you can do depends on when you bought it. So, if you bought it online, you've got better consumer rights than if you bought it in the shop to a certain extent. If you bought it online because you haven't seen it, you've got 14 days to basically cancel it and send it back no matter what. And the person has to give you a refund. You then have 14 days to actually physically make that return happen. In the shop, however, the rules are slightly different. So, okay, if you've bought it online and you return it to a shop, you've still got those online rights. If you've bought something on the high street, you've got 30 days in which you can have your money back if those 3 criteria that I mentioned, those 3 standards aren't met. And that is that you can have your money back. That isn't just that you can get a credit note, because what the whole thing about credit notes, which is quite interesting, is that when you get a receipt, it has a returns policy on it. Maybe most companies have a returns policy. There's no legal requirement of a returns policy. It's a goodwill gesture for the company. So they say, look, we're going to have if you want to bring something back, then you can do. But the returns policy is really only relevant for things where they do meet that criteria. So something you just don't want. So it may be satisfactory quality, it'll be fit for purpose, and it was as described, but you take it back because you don't want it. But a company does not have to legally give you your money back. It's only if there's something wrong with it. And so the exchange policy of that company is really only talking about if you want to take something back. Because if they say, oh, we'll do 14 days, you still have your full consumer rights, which I'm going to go through, if there's something wrong with it. You can say, no, I want my money back, because you'll have a lot of places that will give you a credit note. That is relevant if there's nothing wrong with the item and you're just taking it back because you don't want it. If it's got a hole in it or there's something wrong with it, don't be fobbed off with a credit note. You've got a consumer right to get your money back. So if it's within 30 days, you can have your money back. If it's beyond that 30 days and it's less than 6 months, then the onus is on the seller to prove that they met the 3 standards. And they obviously have to offer a repair or a replacement for your item. So that is what they're legally obliged to do. If they try that and they can't and it doesn't work out, then they have to give you a full refund if unsuccessful. If it gets beyond 6 months, you still have some rights, and it's less than 6 years, then the onus flips. It has to be onto you to prove that the 3 standards weren't met. It wasn't satisfactory quality, it wasn't fit for purpose, and it wasn't as described. That's going to be pretty tricky, so you're going to end up having to get to the point where you're having to get some form of expert opinion or something like that. But don't get fobbed off at Christmas when you take something back and it's got a hole in it and they go, I'll give you a credit note. Stand your ground, get your money back, and go move on. Don't forget as well that you've obviously got your Section 75 of the Consumer Credit Act rights, as well as that, if you pay on credit card. And if you want to know more about that, you can search on moneytothemasses.com or go back to our previous podcast where we've talked all about the Section 75 of the Consumer Credit Act.
Good stuff. Very timely around Christmas. So know your consumer rights, people. Next week, Damien, you mentioned we're going to be back next week. There's some exciting stuff for people to be tuning in for. Is that right?
Yes. If you're a fan of this podcast, you'll want to listen to next week's show, because we've got some quite exciting announcements about developments that we're doing at Money to the Masses and changes. And especially if you've been to some of our meetups, you're going to like this. So listening to next week's podcast, because we're going to leave it as a bit of the last one of 2018 to tell you about some stuff in 2019.
Take it as our little Christmas present for you, dear listener. Brilliant stuff. So if you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's at moneytothemasses with a number 2 on Twitter, and also email Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Damien spelt with an I-E, D-A-M-I-E-N. Damien, we're done. I enjoyed it this week. Looking forward to next week. Tell me your Christmas tree is up by now.
It's been well and truly up for a good week or so.
Good. Until next time.
Until next time.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.